I've had my Suzuki V-Strom 800DE for just over a year now, and I think I've finally finished buying all of the accessories this bike needs. So today I'll run through the accessories I've put on this bike, I'll briefly tell you a little bit about each of them, and I'll tell you how much they cost with a grand total at the end of the video. Starting at the front of the bike then, and we have the MRA touring screen. It doesn't generate too much wind noise or turbulence, it does a fantastic job of keeping wind off me on the motorway, and it only cost me 80 quid second hand on eBay. Love it! Next is the Quadlock mount, which is another excellent option. The bar I've mounted this to is pretty skinny, so I had to use the Quadlock mirror mount, which fits smaller bars than the normal handlebar Quadlock. Although even then I still had to wedge a small bit of plastic inside the mount ring to make it grip on. I also bought the Quadlock vibration damper to protect my phone, and I've had no problems with it in the first 5,000 miles of this bike. All in all, 50 quid well spent. Next up we have the Hepco Becker crash bars. These weigh an absolute ton, I think they're about 3 or 4 kilograms, and along with a few other heavy bits I've added, they do make this bike feel very heavy. But they're rock solid, they protect the bike, and they provide a place for me to mount auxiliary lights. Now I have dropped the bike once with these bars on when I went green laning, and the bars did their job very well, as there were no scratches or marks anywhere on the bike, except of course for the bars. There is a bit of rust on the part of the bars that touch the ground, and I've since discovered that you can get these little crash bar protectors that would have prevented that. Now because this bike is quite tall and heavy, I find it very droppable, so this is another essential purchase for me, and I got the bars second hand off eBay for just 120 quid. The auxiliary lights I mounted to the bars are from Oxford. Now I've made a separate video on them, but in short, they are absolutely brilliant. The stock headlight on this bike is pretty pathetic, and I feel much safer riding at night with these on. Also, I have them turned on 100% of the time, and nobody's ever flashed me in the 6 months I've had them fitted, so I don't think they're too bright for oncoming traffic. They cost me £172, and now I've had them on, I'd never have an adventure bike without auxiliary lights. Moving on to the sexiest accessory, and we have the SC Project Rally Raid exhaust. When I bought it, I drilled out the baffle rivets so I could remove the baffle more easily. With the baffle out, it does have a little more bark, but actually I find it just gives it an irritating drone on long journeys, so I now have the baffle in all of the time. Again, I've made a separate video on the exhaust, but the only other thing to say is that it weighs about 3 kilos or 6.5 pounds less than the stock exhaust, which is a welcome weight saving. The only downside of the exhaust was the price, which was 650 quid, including a 100 quid import duty that I was charged after I bought it. Next up is the cruise control module. There's no Suzuki option for cruise control, but I managed to find an aftermarket option from a Canadian company called Veridian Cruise. I've only just had it installed less than 100 miles ago, so I can only give you my first impressions for now, and it is quite basic in that the plus and minus buttons only go up in approximately 1.5 to 2 mile an hour increments instead of the usual 1 mile per hour increments, and you can't disengage the cruise control by rolling the throttle forward or pulling the clutch in, but changing gear or touching either the front or the rear brake does disengage it, and I find it easiest just to tap the rear brake. Ultimately though, it does what it says on the tin, and cruise control was the one major thing missing from this bike for me, so I'm really happy with it. And it only cost me 300 quid plus an hour's labour from my local Suzuki dealer, so I think it was reasonably priced. A subtle mod next up in the shape of the Denali SoundBOMB Mini. Now install of this was supposed to be plug and play, but I actually found it a lot more fiddly than I anticipated, but ultimately it sounds so much better than the stock horn, as I'll demonstrate now. If you want to know more, you can watch the full video I made on it. Otherwise, all that's left to say is that it only cost me 30 quid, so it was a nice and cheap mod. Next up, and we have the one area where I spent the most money, luggage. I have the SW Motech Pro tank ring at the front, on which I mount either the smaller day pack tank bag that is fine for most jobs and can take a sandwich, a bottle of water and a disc lock, or the larger Pro City tank bag that still doesn't get in my way but takes a lot more stuff. Now I actually carry the tank ring and bags over from a previous bike, but I'll include the cost of the ring and the day pack, which is the bag I use 90% of the time, and the total cost of those two was 130 quid. Then we have the SW Motech panniers and the top case. I bought the top case on day one and I use it on almost every ride. It fits a full face helmet in large, albeit my action camera needs to come off first. The optional backrest isn't especially padded, but my wife appreciates the security of having a box behind her, and it costs £565, which is roughly the same as the official Suzuki option, but with the benefit that I will probably keep this luggage for my next bike, whereas I wouldn't have done if I'd bought the Suzuki branded stuff. Then there's the SW Motech panniers. Now I only bought these relatively recently, so I can't tell you much about them. However, install was pretty easy and they're reasonably spacious, albeit a helmet won't fit in either case. And they do make the bike quite a lot wider, and because they sit much lower than the official Suzuki panniers, you can't see them in your mirrors, which is a bit disconcerting when filtering through traffic. But ultimately, I'll only ever use them on long tours, so it is what it is. They were £976, which is pretty expensive, and I then went and bought the SW Motech toolbox for an additional £117, so all in all I've spent the thick end of £2 on luggage for this bike. Now we're almost at the point at which I can tell you the total cost I've spent on accessories, and there are just 4 things left. First is the official Suzuki tank pad. It is tiny, it cost £45, and I don't find that my jacket ever touches the tank anyway, so this was probably a waste of money. Then I have the SW Motech kickstand shoe that I carried over for my last bike. It stops the bike from sinking if you park on soft terrain, so it was worth the 50 quid. And there's the Hepco Becker centrestand, which I absolutely love. Again, it's very heavy, so it adds a good few kilos of weight, and it turns out that the technique for centre standing a bike takes a bit of getting used to, and I almost stacked the bike on my first attempt. But a few months in and I've more or less nailed it, and it means that I clean the chain more often than I would do otherwise, so it was 230 quid well spent. And the final accessory I bought was the official Suzuki heated grips. They don't get as hot as I'd like, and to see what level they're at you have to change the heat level, then watch to see if the light flashes once for low, twice for medium, or 3 times for high, which is all very distracting. And at 350 quid, they're also pretty poor value for money. They do a job though, but really the only thing they have going for them is that they're quite subtle and don't have a big control box like the standard Oxford hot grips, which wouldn't really have anywhere to go given the other controllers I already have for the auxiliary lights and cruise control. So that is all the options then, but what was the total cost? Well, the first thing I need to tell you is that I got £1,500 off the cost of the bike, so the bike cost me £9,500 instead of the 11 grand list price. However, I made up that saving quite quickly, and all of the options I've bought for this bike cost me a whopping £3,865, which takes the grand total I spent on the bike to £13,365. Now that is quite a lot of cash for a middleweight adventure bike, but just over half of that was spent on luggage that I'll keep for years after this bike has gone, so if you'll allow me some man maths, the total cost of the options excluding the luggage was £1,800, which means the bike in total cost me £11,300, which is just £300 above the normal list price of 11 grand before my discount. And to be fair, even the full 13.5 grand I think is reasonable value. Ultimately, this is a really good adventure bike and it is now fully spec'd, so for less than 14 grand, I think that's not bad. Now I don't have anything else on my wanted list, so I think I'm pretty much done, but let me know if you think I've missed any must-haves, and I'll put all of my V-Strom content in this playlist so you can work your way through that next. Now if you've got any questions, let me know in the comment section below on your way to the like and subscribe buttons, and until next time, ride safe.